It has been a while since we've been in this series. We've had a bunch of other things here and there that we've looked at, and so we've not been looking at these once a month for a little bit as we had been before. But we'll get back into this series. So what we've been doing is looking at fulfilled prophecies, specifically fulfilled prophecies in about a 24-hour period that surrounds the Passover, the arrest, and the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And I labeled it 24 plus. Originally, it was going to be 24 fulfilled prophecies in 24 hours. No, it's plus. There's more than 24 prophecies fulfilled inside that 24-hour period. And so I think the last number I had was something like 32, 33, somewhere in that range. But there may be more. In fact, there's an estimated 353 prophecies about the Messiah in the Bible that Jesus, of course, is the fulfillment. And so far in this series, we've considered, and this isn't an extensive list, but sort of the ideas that we've looked at, the preparation for the Passover, the 30 pieces of silver and the betrayer eating bread with the Messiah. We've talked about the disciples stumbling and Peter's denial of Jesus, Caiaphas's prediction of Jesus' death, and then the conspiracy among the rulers, Jesus remaining silent before his accusers, and him being spat upon and struck during the trial. And so those are the things that we've looked at and labeled them with specific prophecies beforehand that had said these things would take place. And so we'll add 3 additional in our lesson today, Lord willing, as we continue in studying. And so I want us to talk about the false accusations that were levied against Jesus. So the chief priests and the Jewish council, they desired very much to put Jesus to death. And what Matthew tells us, Matthew chapter 26 and verse 59 and 60, the chief priests, the elders, and the council, all the council, sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. Now, if they were able to get truthful testimony, they would have accepted that. That would have been great to have truthful testimony, but there was none. And they really had no interest in upholding justice or conducting a fair trial. That's evident by the fact that they're doing it overnight. But they're also trumping up these false witnesses in the process. The outcome had already been determined, right? They already decided Jesus is going to die. That is the outcome of the trial, regardless of what anybody says. That is what they want as the outcome. And so even in the absence of legitimate testimony, well, we'll just have to find some testimony. We'll just have to find some witnesses, right? And so that's what they did. And it appears that there was no shortage of false witnesses. As you read in verse 60, many false witnesses came forward. Many came forward. Now, where did these false witnesses come from? The text never tells us. In fact, none of the 4 Gospels really tell us who these false witnesses are. Now, are they the average people and some who happen to be discontented with Jesus for one reason or another? I guess that's a possibility. I wonder if these are some of the scribes and maybe students of the different religious sects associated with the religious leaders, maybe some of the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are lower down in the pecking order might make up some of these false witnesses. No text ever tells us who they are, just that they were there, and they were there with numbers. There were many false witnesses who came forward. But despite having several false witnesses to step up and bear testimony, even they don't agree. You'd think maybe they could have got together and talked about what they're going to bear as witness beforehand, but they didn't do that. And so a bunch of them come together, and none of them agree either on what it is that they're bearing witness of. And here's the thing, it's required under the law of Moses, that when an accusation is brought forward against someone, that it be attested to by 2 or 3 independent witnesses. And so the judges then need to make careful investigation. It's not just, oh, hey, we had 2 or 3 witnesses. There we go, we're good. That's not it. The judges, by the law of Moses, were required then to make a comprehensive examination of the accusations that are levied by these witnesses, lest the witnesses have conspired together to bear false testimony. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and at verse 15, it says, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity, or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. If a false witness rises against a man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days. And the judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, so you shall put away evil from among you. I don't know if they're paying very close attention to that, right? If they were, I'm not willing to be a false witness in that. And I don't know why any of these false witnesses would be willing to go do that, right? Did you catch that last little bit? If the witness is false and has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. That means that they are perhaps putting themselves at risk of being put to death, because that is what they're trying to do to Jesus. Maybe the Pharisees and the scribes, they didn't tell these witnesses what all was in store with this, right? But they have an in because they've already determined the outcome of the trial, and that is that Jesus is guilty. They don't care what the testimony is. They don't care who the witnesses are. That's okay. They can put all that underneath the rug and we'll just ignore that. Remember in John chapter 8, when they brought Jesus, the woman who was caught in adultery, and they want Jesus to judge her. And there was one thing that was missing. Where's the man? She didn't commit adultery by herself, right? Where's the man? They weren't interested in justice. They were just interested in finding a way to catch Jesus. Because in that case, if he says, yes, she should be put to death, then they go to the Romans and say, hey, this guy's saying that we have the right to put people to death and we don't have that right. You might want to deal with him. If he doesn't say should be put to death, then, well, he's saying that God's law is not valid anymore. And so they bring that accusation against him before the people. Of course, what Jesus did is he turned it back on them. He wasn't a witness. Therefore, he's not the one who is responsible to cast judgment or to cast stones. And so he turned it back on them, and they all walked away. So, but they're just devious in the way that they're dealing with this. All right, so back to Matthew 26 and at the latter part of verse 60. It says, at last, 2 false witnesses came forward and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So they finally found 2 people who said the same thing, sort of. I say sort of because Mark 14 verse 59 says of these 2 witnesses, not even then did their testimony agree. So they didn't quite say the same thing, but it was close enough, right? Close enough, we'll take it. And so they would run with that. Of course, that's not going to work coming before Pilate later on. Pilate didn't care what he said about the temple. But what they're doing is they're also misrepresenting Jesus' statement, because he didn't say that. At no point did Jesus say, destroy the temple and I will build it in 3 days. He said, destroy this temple, talking about his body, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And so, again, false witnesses not interested in bearing testimony to the truth. And so they've got their false witnesses. Now, there are some Psalms which, when we go back and we read them, they are obviously messianic Psalms. There's a host of them. Psalm 2 is obviously messianic. Psalm 16, messianic. Psalm 22, messianic. 69, messianic. There's a whole host of them. I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 19 that it's just evident these are messianic Psalms. There are others which are not so obvious or may not be inherently messianic, and yet there are statements or concepts from them that are certainly applicable to the Messiah and fulfilled in the Messiah. And I think the one that deals with the false testimony is of that sort, where it's not inherently a messianic psalm, and yet there's a point to be made by the Spirit of God from this Old Testament psalm that's happening in the life of Christ. And so Psalm 27 is the psalm that we're drawing from. And again, nothing in the psalm says it is specifically about the Messiah. And yet there are some things in it that fit the Lord's situation. And so it's about somebody who is constantly pursued by the wicked. That is descriptive of Jesus. Not Jesus only, but that is descriptive of Jesus. He trusts in God and perpetually seeks God's way. He is forsaken by those who are closest to him, even by his family. Jesus was forsaken by his family. And he knows that the Lord is going to take care of him in the midst of that, even when his family have turned away from him. But in Psalm 27 and at verse 12, perhaps we have the Old Testament foretelling of what would happen with the Messiah as he was before the Sanhedrin. And so, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such as breathe out violence. Now, I have no doubt that also happened in the life of David. Several of the messianic psalms played themselves out in David's life beforehand. And yet they found an additional fulfillment in the life of Christ. And I would suggest that is the case here, that it is being fulfilled in both David's life, but also in the life of the Messiah. The false witnesses who rose up against him, it wasn't just to make him look bad. It was because they had violence on their mind. They wanted to destroy Jesus. They wanted him to be put to death. And so, what's intriguing is how the Lord then responds to the false testimony. Anyone here like it when people speak falsely about you? We don't, right? We don't like to hear people misuse our words and misapply our words and things of that nature. Matthew 26, verse 62. Notice how Jesus responds to their false testimony. The high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent. Didn't say a thing. He's heard all kinds of false witnesses come along, and he's heard everything they've heard, and many false witnesses came along, and they couldn't find any that were in agreement. But finally, two show up who sort of sound the same, but not exactly, as Mark told us. And so the high priest is wondering, well, why aren't you defending yourself? Why aren't you answering this? And Jesus continues to say nothing. The only time that he then speaks up is when they challenge him. Tell us, are you indeed the Son of God? And then he bears witness to himself. But so far as the false testimony, he felt no need to respond to it. He just said nothing. The high priest had already asked Jesus earlier about his teaching and about his disciples. He made the statement in John 18, verse 20, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret, I have said nothing. I've said everything that needs to be said. Mark 14, verse 49, he has said to many of them, I was daily with you in the temple and you did not seize me. I've been around you. What's special about today that you're doing it now, right? So he's borne witness to himself, and so he feels no need to answer at this point. And his silence is not an admission of guilt. That's not it. Sometimes people stay quiet because, hey, I got nothing to say, right? Maybe they've been caught. That's not it. It's not an admission of guilt, but rather he felt no need to counter their falsehoods. He has spent his entire ministry demonstrating that he walks in truth and righteousness. And so they bring in a few people who can't even agree about what he did or what he said. It's not worth it. There's no need to respond to that. His integrity has already been established, and his silence in the face of their accusation is the answer itself. It doesn't warrant response. I think that's a great example for us. If we live a life that is serving God, that is righteous, that is holy, that is an imitation of the life of Christ, and there's false witnesses who are saying things about us, there are certainly times when, yes, it is appropriate and right and we ought to respond. And there are other times where maybe we just leave it alone and let others determine whether the false witness is correct or whether our integrity stands. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 3 at verse 7, he said that there is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. I am still learning which is which. And I think we're all sort of in that boat. Then, you ever had that occurrence where you said something and then you're thinking afterward, well, that was dumb. I shouldn't have said that. Or where maybe you didn't say something, you think afterward, I should have really said something there, right? We're all learning about that. But we don't need to feel compelled to always defend ourselves at every word of opposition. Just because somebody speaks against us doesn't mean we have to answer. Sometimes silence is the right response. Just let people consider the evidence rather than us needing to speak up. And if there is a verbal response that is required, do it with a calm spirit. Do it showing integrity. Do it demonstrating righteousness. So we've got Jesus falsely accused. The second thing I want us to look at today is the method of death that would be used in order for them to kill him. And so after the chief priests and the elders have concluded their mock trial, they lead Jesus off to Pilate. And John chapter 18 records part of the conversation. And so Pilate asked them, John 18, verse 29, what accusation do you bring against this man? So they've made a spectacle, right? It's early morning, and they have marched him bound to the praetorium and presumably called for Pilate to come out. And so surely there must be some heinous criminal acts that this man is guilty of that demands at this early hour in the morning that Pilate come and see him to warrant this kind of entrance. What accusation do you bring against this man? Their answer was rather deflating. If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. What kind of answer is that? We want you to put this man to death, but we're not going to tell you what he did. If he weren't evil, then we wouldn't have brought him here. Just take us at our word. Well, Pilate doesn't want to do that. He doesn't trust their word. But they just deflated their credibility. When somebody comes to you and they're expecting something, but they can't explain why you ought to do what they're demanding that you do, you're not likely going to do it. If he weren't an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Refuse to name any charges, and that means that they don't actually have any charges that are of interest to Pilate. He is a Roman governor. He doesn't care about the workings of their law. He doesn't care if he offended them in some way. And so Pilate's retort to them is this: you take him and judge him according to your law. He perceived, well, he did something to upset the religious leaders of the Jews. Therefore, he violated their law in some fashion, or he taught something that they don't like, whatever it be. It's something about their law. Go and deal with it yourself. If it's a Jewish matter, If it's something of your law or your customs, you deal with it. It's not my business. But here's the problem. They alone cannot accomplish what they set out to do. They can't put him to death. And so therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. He needs to be put to death. He's worthy of death. But we can't do that. And their statement is a true statement. They do not have the right to put anyone to death. That was removed. That was taken from them. When Judea became a Roman province in 6 or 7 AD, they forfeited the right to capital crimes. They were not permitted. Now, under the law of Moses commanded them to put people to death by means of stoning if they were guilty of certain crimes. But when they became a Roman province, they forfeited that. They could not do that anymore. They were now under Roman law. So they could conduct the trial, they could prescribe the sentence, but they could not execute the sentence. Now, there is a possible workaround which they did from time to time. If they could instigate a riot, and then Jesus happens to die in the midst of that, that would have worked, right? We see them doing that in Acts chapter 7. That's how Stephen died. Stephen is giving his defense before the Sanhedrin. They stop up their ears. They're angry at him. They rush at him with a mob, and he ends up being taken out and being stoned. And I don't know if there was any consequences brought against them for that by the Romans. So they could do something like that maybe, and that would bring about Jesus' death, if they could somehow get the people risen up into a tumult. But the problem is most of the average people support Jesus. In fact, they were afraid to bring charges against Jesus. Matthew chapter 26 and at verse 5, they had first determined not to pursue Jesus during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. We might be the one that die rather than him if that happens. And so that's why at first they didn't want to, but then Judas comes and he offers to betray Jesus. And so now the chief priests and the scribes are racking their brains like, how can we do this? Luke chapter 22 and at verse 2, the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill Jesus, for they feared the people. Well, we have to come up with a plan, but we can't just have a riot. Riots are convenient to kill people at times when everybody else doesn't like that person too, but that's not going to work for Jesus. And so they had to figure something out. So the solution was to get Pilate to kill Jesus. That'll work. Despite the rough start, and this is a rough start. What evil has this man done? If he weren't evil, we wouldn't have brought him to you. That's not a good start. Eventually, they're able to force his hand and have Jesus put to death by the Romans. Now, our interest, however, is in the latter portion of verse 32. So it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. That is, Jesus foretold how he was going to die. He prophesied it. He spoke it beforehand. And he did so multiple times. So shortly after the feeding of the 4,000, and that's maybe a year removed from the time that Jesus is crucified, thereabouts, it says in Mark chapter 8 and verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And so it's a very generic statement at that point. He's just simply saying to them that I'm going to be put to death and I'll rise again. Doesn't tell them the means or the method. And you'll recall on that occasion, that's when Peter took him aside and actually rebuked him for it, right? Not so, Lord, it can't be. That's not going to work. That won't happen. It's believed by some that, again, that was just over a year, or just under a year, excuse me. Mark 9:31, so that's 8:31. Mark 9:31, he taught his disciples and said to them, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day. That's parallel in Matthew 17 and again in Luke chapter 9. In Mark 9, verse 32, it says they didn't understand what he was talking about. Like, that doesn't make any sense. He's the Messiah. How's the Messiah going to be put to death, right? And so he's already been telling them along for a bit here what's going to happen. Mark 10, verse 33. So Mark 8, Mark 9, Mark 10. And Mark 8 and 9 are both verse 31. The next one is verse 33. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed by the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. Do you see the difference this time? He will be turned over to the Gentiles. This is paralleled in Matthew 20 and verse 18 and 19, Luke 18, verse 31 to 33. But in Matthew's account, notice it expressly says he will be turned over to the Gentiles to mock and discourage and to crucify. Jesus told them beforehand, they will crucify me. Not just that the chief priests and the elders will turn on him, but they will turn him over to the Romans and he would be crucified. He foretold the method by which he would be killed. John's gospel actually has more to say on it. In the early part of the week in which Jesus was betrayed, he made the statement, and if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all peoples to myself. John 12, verse 32. If I be lifted up, what's he talking about, being lifted up? Well, that's what happened on the cross. He was lifted up. The next verse, John goes on to say this, he said, signifying by what death he would die. But there's more. John 8, verse 28. Jesus in front of a crowd at Jerusalem, he says, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father taught me, I speak these things. And so again, he said, I'm going to be lifted up. You're going to lift me up. You're going to have me crucified. But remember all the way back in John 3, a conversation with Nicodemus. And as he's talking with Nicodemus, John 3 and verse 14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. John 3, that's early. That's earlier than Matthew 20 is. That's like a year and a half or so before that, likely. It's a while before. Well, what's he talking about? Moses lifting up some serpent. Well, he's referring to Numbers 21. Over in Numbers 21, the people of Israel are perishing because they were complaining against God. And so the Lord sent poisonous snakes in their midst. And Moses was then instructed by God to create a bronze serpent, to set it on a pole and to lift it up, and that anyone who would look to that bronze serpent would be healed. They would not die, even if they were bitten. Jesus says that is emblematic of him. That just as Moses lifted up that bronze serpent and those who looked to the bronze serpent would live and not die, if Jesus is lifted up, he's put on a cross, those who would look to him would live and not die. And so he foretold multiple times before his crucifixion that that is how he would die, and he told why he would die that way. Again, it goes. God told about that back in Numbers 21. It's just they didn't know what he was talking about at that point because it was prefigured through what Moses had done there. All right, one last thing for us, and the lesson will be yours, and that is the cruel treatment that Jesus received. Isaiah 53 and at verse 3, he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Isaiah 53 is about this suffering servant of God. It is the Messiah. The Family Bible Notes comments on this verse: no one ever came on such an errand of love as the Savior, and no one ever received such treatment at the hands of sinners. He came to save mankind, and yet he was cruelly treated by mankind. And so we find all kinds of rejection and disdain and sadness and despair throughout the Messiah's life. Now, John chapter 1, and at verse 10 and 11, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. That is a really sad verse. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And it's true on multiple levels. He came to the world, and he was widely rejected by the world, and continues to be widely rejected by the world. He came to his own nation, to his own people, the Jewish people, and they often were filled with disdain concerning him, and they refused him. John 6 and verse 66 would be an example of that. From that time, many of his disciples did not walk with him anymore. They turned back and walked with him no more. He comes to his own city, to Nazareth. And in Luke 4 and verse 29, it says that they tried to throw him off the cliff. They wanted to make him king. He didn't, he refused, and so they tried to throw him off the cliff. He was even despised by his own family. Mark chapter 3 and at verse 21, they think that he's crazy. And so they're coming to go and take him back home. They come to where he is. He's inside with a bunch of disciples. They won't even go inside. They're outside. They send a messenger in. Tell Jesus to come out. And so his own family at that point didn't believe in him. John chapter 7, verse 5, his brothers specifically were told in that text did not believe in him. And so there are numerous times that we could point to throughout his ministry where he was despised and rejected, where he endured sorrow and grief. But specifically in this 24-hour period that we're talking about, there are several fulfillments of Isaiah's prophecy. And so, first of all, consider the heartache of having to identify Judas, one of his own, as a betrayer. That had to be difficult. That had to bring grief to Jesus to do that. Just filled with sorrow, because here's one that is his, and yet this one has turned against him, is a betrayer. As he's in the garden, Jesus was in agony in prayer. We're told that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground, Luke 22 and at verse 44. Again, you'll think about the grief associated with Judas coming later and greeting him with a kiss. Like, talk about adding insult to injury. He's rejecting him, he's betraying him, and then he does so with a sign of friendship by kissing him. And then the mob arrested Jesus. Mark chapter 14, verse 50, all of his disciples forsook him. He was despised and rejected by men, including his own disciples. When he's brought into the trial, he is mocked, he is beaten, he is blasphemed by the Jewish officers. First of all, Luke 22, 63 through 65. And then he appears before Herod's men. And what we're told is that Herod's men of war treated him with contempt and mocked him, Luke 23 and verse 11. And then he's brought back before Pilate's men after that. And he's brought before Pilate's men. We're told that they scourged him. They put a scarlet robe on him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They put a reed in his hand. They bowed before him and they mocked him. They spat on him. They struck him with the reed, Matthew 27, verse 26 through 31. Prophet said that he would be despised and rejected, that he would be acquainted with sorrow and with grief. And that's not all the text that we could look at in that 24-hour period. There's more. Really, it's descriptive of many parts of Jesus' life, that he was despised, rejected, acquainted with sorrow, acquainted with grief. But understand this. He endured all that because he loves you and he loves me. That's why he was willing to do that. You're not going to find just anyone who's willing to endure all of that. Most people would give up on that. It's just not worth it. Jesus considers your soul to be worth it. And therefore, he willingly bore hostility and hardship, eventually resulting in his death on the cross. Because he loves us. That's why he's the suffering servant of the Lord and of the Lord's people. You keep on going in Isaiah 53, and we find the victory in him at the end. He bore our sins. He carried our sorrows. We'll get to those things in future studies, no doubt. But Jesus was willing to endure that for us. Falsely accused, foretold his death and how it would happen, cruelly treated, all these things fulfilled by way of prophecy or mentioned by way of prophecy, and then fulfilled in this time that Jesus was there. Well, what's our response to those kinds of things, right? And there's a whole lot more. First of all, I love seeing fulfilled prophecy. Fulfilled prophecy should bolster our faith. The more that we see that, oh, hang on, it was said back here like 800 years before Jesus, and then here it is coming to pass, that should cause our faith to grow in God and in his word. But then don't lose sight of the fact that he did this because he wants us in heaven. We have a loving God who has made us in his image. And by Jesus Christ, he's called us to be his people. And so may we endeavor to serve him as we ought to. That brings us to 13, I believe, fulfilled prophecies in this series thus far. There's a lot more. As I said, 32, 33, something in that range is where I'm at in the totals that I've accumulated. There might be more. But understand, Jesus fulfilled all these to demonstrate he is Messiah, and therefore he is my Savior and your Savior. If we can help you in your walk with the Lord, we want to. If we can be praying for you, what can we be praying for you? We can be studying together. What do we need to be studying together? How can we help you to grow? That's what we want to do, is help one another to grow and to have that hope of heaven set before us. And so if we can help in some way, let us know as we stand together, as we say.